The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar today. We'll be talking about global hiring challenges, and before I introduce myself and our panelists, would like to go over a few housekeeping rules. First, you can send us your questions via the chat window through the webinar. The panelists will answer during the Q&A segment, and any questions that are not answered will be addressed directly with you at a later time. A copy of the presentation and the recording will be made available to you within 1 week from today. We'll send it to the email ID that you registered with. If you happen to face any issues with audio or have technical difficulties, please send us a note via the chat window and our organizer will help you. I'd like to start first. My name is Paul Court. I will be your moderator today. I'm the Director of Staffing for Global Upside, primarily responsible for direct hire placement, interim staffing, RPO, and retained search. A little bit about my background: 20 plus years in the staffing industry, spent 9 years with Robert Half International, achieved some nice accolades through my tenure there. And my passion is really helping companies increase their global brand awareness, improve talent acquisition efficiency, and increase their visibility for business leaders who need accurate, real-time data for human capital management. So our first panelist is Raghu Bhargava. He is our CEO and co-founder of Global Upside. Raghu has a passion for helping companies go global. He's been a public company CFO himself, and as a founder of Global Upside, he has firsthand knowledge of the challenges of doing business overseas. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Raghu Bhargava.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome everybody to the webinar. Hopefully you learn a thing or two and help you with your growth plans as you go international. Paul has already introduced me, so I'm just going to go into introducing the other panelists. Our second panelist is Chrissy Martell. She's the Director of HR over at Aclara, and she leads the Aclara HR team, managing the global benefits, payroll, leave administration, HR information, and I should just say everything HR. She is, before Aclara, she was at Magitas, sorry, screwed up that name, and she just went through an acquisition of a division of a very large public company, and she's going to talk about her live experiences in managing an M&A type transaction in an environment where everything needs to be done yesterday. The third panelist we have is Jane Booth. She's a Senior Director of Sales at Globalization Partners. She's been working there for over 5 years and has an extensive experience advising CFOs, controllers, and HR people in expanding over 60 countries from a payroll, HR, and accounting perspective. Globalization Partners is a PEO, and you'll hear a little bit more about that as we turn it over to Jane. So going into the presentation itself, we think about global expansion in two respects. You can hire an employee in that new country that you're expanding to, or you can hire a contractor. And we'll talk about both of those. The seminar really is focused on what are the advantages, disadvantages of either one, and how do you execute to it. So as you expand into a new country, the things that you have to worry about are, why are you going there? What is your objective in that country? What functions are going to be positioned in that company? Sales, R&D, service delivery, could be technical support, could be actual delivery of your hard widgets that are manufactured possibly in the local country, possibly elsewhere. Obviously, you can have a M&A related objective because you may be acquiring a division or acquiring a company where they may have a presence in a country where you had never thought about doing business yourself. also, what you have to think about is what's your footprint going to be? Are you going to have a small footprint because you're expanding your sales force and you need to have one-person sales force in that particular country because you may see an opportunity as just a starting point and hire more people, or you may have a large footprint where you are going to go build a factory or build an R&D center in some country, and so you're going to hire 10, 20, 50, 100, maybe even thousands of people, and how do you structure in either one of those situations? There's obviously the issues around speed to hire. How soon do you need to have that set up? How fast do you need to have your entity up or your operations up? Because sometimes you may get a call from the sales team, hey, we just hired somebody in France, can you put him on payroll starting tomorrow? It happens very regularly. But the considerations you have to worry about is the incorporation registration, the bank accounts, the employment contracts, the benefits, and these are just some of the things that you have to worry about to get started. And then one of the things we're going to cover is obviously risk mitigation from a permanent establishment perspective. So if you have an employee in a foreign country, that causes your U.S. entity or the parent company to have a permanent establishment in that country, how do you deal with that? Taxation, things like that. Obviously, there is employment law because you're employing people elsewhere, and quite possibly immigration, especially if you're employing a third country national in another country. So, a Singaporean national working in France, you may have to deal with immigration issues. Having set the stage, I do want to turn it over to Jane, and she's going to talk about the PEO model and the first steps people take generally when they're trying to go overseas. Jane?
Yes, thank you, Raghu. I'd actually like to start with independent contractors, which is the avenue we see a lot of companies using when they first start overseas. They typically have a new hire in a brand new country. They have no entity there. They need to pay this person, but how are they going to do that? And really, for a long time, the only option that has been open to them previously has been to pay them as an independent contractor, which allows them to pay direct. They don't have to set up an entity. They don't need a bank account there. Some contractors can prefer it. They may have one or two other clients as well, so it suits them. Although I will say from previous experience, do be careful if a contractor is very keen on the contractor route, and be careful that they don't start calling the tune too much, that they want paid in USD into a US bank account and so on. But some of the issues around having an independent contractor are that I think, first of all, it can very much limit the talent pool. Employees overseas often get a lot more benefits through statutory benefits, statutory social security, and also a lot more protection under labor law than they would see in the US. And as such, they want the security of having their health care provided through social security. You want the security of being employed under local labor law. It can also result in a number of misclassification woes. We're all familiar with the issue of 1099s being reclassified as employees and the cost that can go with that. You may think, well, I might only have one person overseas in that particular country. What's the chances of being discovered? Well, some countries do monitor funds that are moving from a corporate bank account into a personal bank account in that country and have the means to do it, and it gets red flagged. That's not to say it will be discovered, but certainly there are means to discover it. But I think particularly what I've seen happen in the past on a number of occasions is that if you want to part company with your contractor and you don't give them a settlement that they're happy with, they can essentially threaten to turn whistleblower because they're fully aware of what this might cost should this get flagged up to the authorities and negotiate a significant payout. Next slide, please. Put just a couple of numbers together about what that might look like. If you were paying your independent contractor a fee of, say, $100,000 a year, if you're assessed, if you end up being reassessed, you would have to pay withholding tax, and that amount will be taken as a net amount. So if you gross that up, say at a withholding rate of 35%, you're adding in 50-odd thousand of tax. If you're in a country like France, where the social security burden is 46%, you would add on 46% to your gross amount. The awards can go back assessments can go back over several years. I mean, if you take 3 years worth of both your withholding and your payroll taxes, you're immediately well north of 300,000, and that's before you look at penalties and interest. And by the way, if the authorities go down that route, they can then start looking at, hey, so what are you actually doing in our country business-wise? Let's have a look at your corporate tax situation as well. So it can open up a whole can of worms. So our route, we are a global PEO, and this is a way that we help companies. A global PEO will help companies employ individuals as employees overseas without them having to set up the entity. So the way that a global PEO works is that the individual is hired through the PEO's local entity in that country. So that means that there is a locally compliant employment contract. Payroll is issued with all of the correct withholding payroll taxes being made. Statutory benefits are provided. Expenses are typically reimbursed through payroll. All the local compliance is done. You know, the W-2 equivalents. Some countries will also have a benefits in kind taxation form as well. So any type of compliance is down to the PEO as well. And essentially, the PEO will hire this individual on the company's behalf and then assign their services back to the client. So the client will manage this employee on a day-to-day basis. So the employee will walk and talk like the client's employee, but it will actually be the PEO's employee in terms of recognition of the tax authorities. So that's essentially how the model works. So the reasons why companies would use a PEO would be, first of all, it's a very fast solution. The entities are already set up under the PEO's model, so the employee can be hired in a matter of days. It's just a matter of issuing the employment contract and setting up the payroll in that country. It also broadens the talent pool. As I mentioned earlier, individuals in many other countries would prefer to be hired as an employee and be covered by local labor law, so that they would have for instance, a statutory notice period, statutory holidays, and they also get often many more benefits through Social Security. Many countries have the full medical provision provided by Social Security. It's also a very flexible approach. If you're making a first hire in a country and it doesn't work out, either the employee isn't a good fit or maybe they resign after a couple of months, then an arrangement with a PEO is typically on a month-to-month basis. So you can wrap up the arrangement and then you're free and clear in that country. You know, there's no corporate structure left behind if the employee leaves. So you haven't gone to all that effort to set the structure up only to find that your one employee then leaves. And then you may decide that actually Portugal wasn't the right market in the first place and you'd rather be in Germany. And it also reduces risk. You are transferring the compliance obligations from the company to the global PEO. They are the legal employer after all, so it's their responsibility to maintain compliance. And it also means that companies aren't expected to keep up with all the changes in local labor law in however many countries around the world that they are in, you know, keep up to speed with all that. The PEO has to do that because they are the legal employer. So some typical scenarios where a company might use a PEO. The most common one, I would say, would be the first hire in a new country. You know, we're hiring a salesperson in Germany, exploring the market. You know, we want to see how that goes. let's see how much business is there, if we get much traction there before we commit to setting up an entity. But certainly as the business grows, then there is definitely a natural progression out of the PEO and into an entity. Then there's what I call the outlier hire. This would be somebody like an amazing software engineer in Poland that the engineering team absolutely has to hire. But there's no plans to set up a large software team in Poland. So that would be somebody who could well sit on the books of a PEO for years. No plans for growth. That person is happily and safely secure in employment. Then the convert contractors to employees. I've often seen this, for instance, companies that grow that, for instance, may go public or certainly get to a certain size. They really want to get their arms around the risk that they have around those contractors. They've often gone down and got the contractor route and got several dotted around the world, and they want to get their arms around that risk for all the reasons I've mentioned earlier. We've certainly done a number of exercises as part of an acquisition. Companies that have a particular type of acquisition, whether it's a spin-off or a carve-out, if the asset, say a company selling a particular division, certain individuals will move over with that division. And I've often seen handfuls of employees in countries overseas that are left homeless when the acquisition happens. A PEO can be a good route for housing those individuals either on the short or the long term. A good way to avoid setting up entities for those small headcount countries. And it's also better employee engagement. What often happens in those situations is that these employees are left on the seller's payroll for a set amount of time before they get moved over. If they move over from day one to the buyer, these individuals, ultimately it's the people that are driving the business, and it's a way from an HR perspective to have these individuals feel a lot more engaged with the new employer. And then also for companies that are moving straight away to setting up an entity, that can take several months. Not only might the entity take a few months, but the bank accounts can also take a long time these days with the Know Your Customer regulations. So a PEO can fit in that gap that you may want to get moving in that country already, have some individuals you want to hire. So the PEO will fill the gap essentially as the entity is being set up. So which way to go, PEO or entity? I think that I'll speak to the PEO side and then hand over to Raghu about entity, but I say that particularly the flexibility and the nimble approach of the PEO makes it a good fit in the early stages. So typically those first steps in a country where a company is testing the market, getting some traction in a country, the surprise hires, the VP of sales who walks in to see the VP of HR and says, oh gosh, I've just met this amazing candidate in Korea, just send her an employment contract and get her on payroll for next month, will you? And what's the VP of HR meant to do? There's no entity there, there's nothing, and yet it's suddenly a fire drill. So a PEO, as I said, using that ability to get somebody on payroll in days, that's good for a surprise hire. Any country that's going to stay at low volume, where there aren't any real growth plans, it's a way to keep the bureaucracy and administration down. And then, as I've mentioned, it's a very good alternative to contractors, reduces risk, and leads to better engagement. So I would say the PEO has a number of flexible earlier stage applications. Raghu, would you like to mention about when an entity might fit?
Yeah, so the entity, like I started off by talking about what are you planning to do in a particular country. from an expansion perspective or from an M&A perspective really determines the need or the lack thereof flexibility to set up or not set up an entity. So obviously if you're acquiring a large division of, in UK as an example with let's say 50 people, you need an entity. You cannot go down the PEO path because there's just too much complexities around some of this stuff. And even though a PEO model may work very well in a short term, you eventually do need to have your own setup. So a large headcount always drives to that. And obviously there are tax strategies that drive to that. And like Jane was mentioning, as you're starting off in a new country and conducting an experiment about Portugal and figure out it's Germany or you want to stay in Portugal now, it's working out well for you, now you want to hire another 5 people or something like that, that might be a good transition into an entity model. But as you think about entity setup and going down that path, there's obviously a lot of other considerations you have to keep in mind. And some of those I want to talk about is the where and how, and this is really back to the function, and how are you acquiring these employees, say from an M&A perspective or a carve-out perspective. But entity setup and related activities do take a fair number of, can take a fair number of months, if not weeks. It's very typical, for example, in China to take 3 months to set up a new entity before you can start registering and funding the capital and so on and so forth, which can take another month or 60 days. Obviously, there are other countries like Australia as an example where you can incorporate in 1 day. So when the VP of sales walks in and says, I got the best guy that I want to hire in South Korea, and how are you going to make it happen, you also have to worry about not just entity and do you have a legal entity to employ this person, but also do you have an employment contract? Because one of the things you have to worry about it is that in the rest of the world, it is called a contract because it's a bilateral agreement between the employer and the employee. Whereas in the US, it's very different, employment being at will. But before we get more deeper into the employment issues, let me just bring up a couple other points. So how are you going to manage your operations in these 5, 10, 15 or more countries that you're establishing across the globe? Are you going to have a central management from, say, here at US headquarters, or regional, say, UK for EMEA, or Singapore for APAC, or maybe even a more local approach of, because your operations are a little bit more distributed, so then you may need a local support, local management in France, and local management in Singapore, because those are the 2 major locations you have, and rest may not exist or may exist with very small headcounts. And then obviously you have to keep in mind your headquarters support, because you cannot ignore that those people out there in any particular country are still the employees of the parent company, the company in the US or wherever the headquarters are, and that eventually to have a cohesive team across the globe, you need to keep those people in mind, even though they might be 5, 10, 15,000 miles away from your headquarters. How do you manage them, and how do you keep them engaged? Obviously, a properly set up legal entity structure that aligns with your business strategy and everything helps reduce administrative and accounting costs, financial reporting, tax compliance, HR costs, and severance costs, as and when you may have to terminate somebody for various reasons. And the contractor route obviously is the most expensive when you're trying to terminate somebody, but in many countries, in most countries, there is severance is a matter of law, and you have to comply with minimum standards and things like that. Even when you have an employee, even when you have a PEO model, you have to pay those employees certain minimums. Getting a little bit more into employment law, like I mentioned, employment is not at will. That concept does not exist anywhere in the world outside of the US. And in fact, in a lot of countries, there's works council and collective bargaining agreements. And I'm not talking necessarily about unions. Yes, unions are very common in, say, the Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, because it is easier for employers to deal with a union than to deal with each individual employee, because you actually have a lot of stuff is negotiated between the employee and employer. But in countries like France, where as your headcount grows, you are mandated by law to have a works council that governs the relationship between the employee and the employer. And all of these bring a lot of burden to the organization, and you have to think about this. You have to plan for it, because you need to then most probably hire local HR folks, things like that, to support that works council, to work with them. And by the way, the works council there's a tax levied on the company that goes to the government, and the government pays for the works council to exist in every company above a certain size. So there is a lot of complexities in terms of hiring people. There's also the processes around hiring and exiting, because there are much more defined onboarding and exit processes. So in UK, when you terminate an employee, which can be done, UK resembles the US closest in terms of termination issues, but there's a concept of garden leave. So the employee may be, you can force an employee to not come to work, but then you have to pay them to sit at home. That's why it's called garden leave. They sit out there in the garden enjoying the day, and you have to pay for that time that they are actually not allowed to work, and they cannot work legally. So those are complexities. Those are issues you have to worry about. And so when you are conducting a experiment in a particular country, then yes, the PO model is a much better answer. But once you know that you have the right talent and the right market and the right reasons why you're going in there, then obviously the entity option makes a lot more sense. And on top of the hiring, and the hire to retire cycle includes statutory and supplemental benefits, because again, like Jane said, there's big social structures in most countries. All of Western Europe is big social programs. You have to contribute to it. Obviously, France is one of the most famous ones with 46% tax on the employer. But those things have to be addressed and dealt with properly from day one. It's not an option that, yes, once we hit 5 or once we hit 10 headcount, then we can put in a benefits plan and things like that. So those have to be put in place with your first employee. And obviously there's a staffing issue. How do you find people? How do you find the right talent? Irrespective of the function you are creating in that country, how do you then execute to hiring those people, and obviously that whole life cycle management. So beyond the employment law, there's obviously payroll and accounting issues when you have a subsidiary or a legal entity formed in a foreign country. There's all kinds of filing, key filings and deadlines. For example, VAT tax returns initially may start off as an annual filing requirement because you may only have a handful of employees in that country, very low revenue streams and stuff. But as things grow, your VAT requirements, just like in the US, sales tax requirements become quarterly and then monthly and so on and so forth. Obviously, you have to run a payroll because you have these employees on your payroll. You have to run a payroll that is compliant with the local laws. So as an example, in France, you have to report to the government by line item for every employee, every type of tax that is assessed as part of the payroll taxes. And there's quite a few of them. And you have to record that in your GL by that tax also. So as part of financial reporting, you have to do that. So there's a lot of complexities in the local jurisdiction. And in a lot of countries, Italy being an example where your payroll isn't divided by your monthly payroll isn't divided by 12, it is divided by maybe 13, maybe 14, depending on the country, and you are going to pay that 13th paycheck or the 13th and 14th paycheck at various fixed times during the upcoming year. Generally, if it's 14, it's like a June-July payment and a December payment. The idea being the employees are being forced into some savings and getting that savings around, say, holidays or right before the vacation times and things like that to be able to benefit from it. And those are required by law. There's nothing you can do, nothing the employees can do. Obviously, there is management accounts, because you're running a business somewhere. You need management accounting, so you can analyze your operations. You can see how you're going to invest more or less, or those challenges. And then there is statutory accounting. In statutory accounting in a country like France, you have monthly reporting requirements. In most countries, the statutory accounting is an annual requirement. There's obviously year-end issues, so generally statutory audits are required. You have income tax requirements. Obviously payroll taxes, you have to pay them during the year, every month, but then you have annual requirements just like in the US, W-2s, things like that. And stock transactions aren't as simple as in the US. In many countries, the taxability of stock options is on the date of grant, maybe on the date of exercise, maybe on the date of sale, and all of those have to be properly managed, and so that it is beneficial to the employee to get an option. Because sometimes employees may turn around and say, hey, we don't want options because very negative tax consequences for us. So what you heard up till now is a perspective on why PEO, where it makes sense, and things like that. You've also heard about entity setup, going down that path of hiring employees. And now I want to turn over to Chrissy, who's going to talk about, from a practical perspective, what she had to endure to go through one of the acquisitions that Aclara did. Chrissy, over to you.
Great, thank you, Raghu. Thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to be here again. My name is Chrissy Martell, and I'm the Director of HR Operations at Aclara. I've been here for about 10 years. And I think the title of my first slide pretty much says it all for me, becoming a global company overnight. And just for a background, my company, prior to the acquisition that we just did about, I guess, 7 months ago, it's hard to believe, we were about 425 employees, only domestic. The most international experience we had was some offshore resources that we had in India, and that was pretty much the extent of it, and that was just a very simple contractor relationship. So we were informed, I guess early November of last year, that we would be acquiring a large acquisition for us that would mean that we're doubling in size as a company and would become global in countries in Spain, UK, India, Japan, and Chile. And we were also to do this in a very short time frame. I think it was about 5 to 6 weeks. And this was, you know, at the time seemed completely impossible. I did not have any international experience. The folks on my staff had very little experience, if at all. And we were really faced with how are we going to do this? And I was lucky enough to be introduced through my insurance broker to Global Upside. I had actually never had to deal with any sort of outsourcing of payroll or legal entity or you know, benefits outside of the U.S. So I quickly got connected to Global Upside, which was really ultimately going to be responsible for partnering with me to set up payroll immediately in countries of Spain and the United Kingdom. Those were our two major critical areas that we needed to focus on. We were lucky enough to defer the other 3 countries to a later time due to the structure of our the agreement with the seller. So we could easily kind of focus on these 2 countries that had the most employees in them. I believe there was 45 in Spain and there was 10 in UK. So Global Upside was essentially going to help me bring on all of these employees onto a payroll system in a 6-week time frame in both countries, and really act as my advisor on the setup and, you know, ultimately process the payroll for me. So what I learned really quickly during this process was that I was completely out of my realm of what I thought it was going to be. As Raghu and Jane spoke about, each country is so different in terms of setup for their laws and regulations, benefits, and so forth. And I really just had no idea really how complex that whole process could be. So Global Upside initially partnered with me on all of my integration calls with the seller, and really acted as my project manager and really guided me through that whole process. So obviously I had a lot of work to do during that process, but they took on the administrative burden of working with the seller to gather all of the data that was required in order to transfer all of these employees into our setup. All of the registrations that are necessary, Spain in particular, I found to be even more challenging than the United Kingdom, and I still find Spain to be more challenging to navigate for a variety of reasons. So there was a lot of registrations to be set up, and Global Upside did all of that for me. The full implementation of it and just helping me understand and get everything into the mode where we could actually fully process the payroll. And I guess the beauty of using Global Upside for this at that particular moment was we weren't actually going to be processing the payroll on our own. Global Upside was going to be doing the processing of our payroll, which really was a relief to us because we didn't have any experience in this. We really needed time to wrap our arms around, you know, actually how to process the payroll. So they ultimately were going to do that for us, and actually continue to do that for us today, 7 months later, so that we, you know, could come up for air and breathe and be able to learn different things as we were going along. So during the same time, we were using payroll processing. We also had to deal with, at some point, setting up legal entities in the 3 other countries, India, Japan, and Chile. And that took several months for us to talk about internally how we were going to set that up. We dealt with Global Upside and Globalization Partners on that, and talked about all of our different options there. And actually, as I was listening to the beginning presentation, I was wishing that I had the opportunity to hear a presentation before I had to deal with it, because having all of this information ahead of time would have been so helpful to make my process more smooth. But what my lessons learned from the time that we were quickly setting up in UK was that there was way too many people involved in the legal entity setup for the Spain and UK entities. And we really talked to Global Upside about this and wanted to really streamline the process and make it a lot more smoother with the other 3 countries that we needed to put in place. So what we essentially did was we brought on Global Upside, who is processing our payroll, to also help us set up our legal entities, because they offered this service to us as well. So it was really just being partnered with one party who would help walk us through all the different aspects of setting up the legal entity in these 3 countries. It's a very complex process. It can take several months depending on which country that you're in. There's many. When we set up Spain and UK, there was, as I mentioned, about 4 or 5 different parties involved. This time around, setting it up for the India, Japan, and Chile, we only have to deal directly with Global Upside. That has really made the process a lot smoother. They have the expertise. They have the connections in the various countries, which has just made it such a more pleasant process. So the consolidated services for us has really been a tremendous help. And again, it really was a result of having to deal with the Spain and UK issues up front. One of the other challenges that we faced, and Jane spoke about this as well, was, okay, we are setting up these legal entities. It took us a while to figure out what we were going to do in that area. So we lost a little bit of traction, and when we decided to go ahead with the legal entities, it takes time. And at this point, we really were in desperate need to hire employees in 2 of the countries where we did not have legal entities set up, which was India and Chile. And this is really where Globalization Partners jumped in quickly to help us out. And Jane really kind of touched on a lot of these points already, but this allowed us kind of the same situation that Jane was talking about. It's, we have this great person in Chile. We really need to get them on board. And we really couldn't afford to wait for the legal entity to be set up to hire this person. That was months out. That's just not an option. We have a business that we need to keep moving forward. So we've utilized Globalization Partners to hire an individual in Chile, which has been fabulous because, as Jay mentioned, they really they hire the person on for you. There's actually very little that I needed to do in this process, which I appreciated. And they really kind of took the whole process from beginning to end, coordinated with the candidate on the offer, and actually they're providing the benefits and so forth and the payroll. So that in that situation, we're actually able to hire someone on in, I think, less than 2 weeks. And that person is still working with us today. And same situation in India. We have a real need to hire folks in India while we're setting up that legal entity. So we are using Globalization Partners to help us hire those folks there as well. And again, it's just been a win-win on both sides because the candidates are anxious to come on board. And I would say at first I was concerned that maybe using a PEO instead of taking them on to Aclara might not be as appealing. It hasn't been an issue at all when you kind of explain what the situation is going on, and the process was very professional and very straightforward, and the candidates have all had really good experience. So it's really been a good way for us to fill that hiring gap while we move to this next phase with those legal entities. And I can say that, every company has a different situation going on. With our particular situation, we had to set up legal entities for a variety of reasons due to the structure of our agreement. Some companies may not be in that situation, but not one size fits all. But I guess when I walk away from kind of what's gone on over the last 7 months, many lessons learned, but what I did learn in particular was you really need to partner with people who know what they're doing. I was a little bit worried when they told me we would be bringing on this acquisition so quickly, and I was worried that they were going to expect me to kind of figure this out on my own with maybe the help of some legal counsel. And I was very fortunate to get partnered with Global Upside and Globalization Partners very early on, who really were my advocates, my really truly my partner in that process. You really do need to work with folks who know what they're doing to help guide you through that process. And I think I thought in the beginning stages that it would just be a relationship for the 2 months that we needed to make this acquisition happen. And really what I found out is it's really a long-term relationship that we've had to have in place. It doesn't just stop after 2 months. It continues to go on because for various reasons you continue to have challenges and you run into different situations, and you need folks to be able to turn to and ask questions and get guidance and expertise. So for Aclara, it's really just been a great resource for us, and really helped us really look good to the employees in the countries where we had to acquire employees, as we looked like we knew what we were doing, which is what we were hoping for. So I'm sure many of you have questions. I'm happy to be able to answer any of those. So I think we have a Q&A session that's coming up, so I will pass that on.
Great. Thank you, Chrissy. So first of all, appreciate all the questions that we've received from the attendees. Thank you for sharing them. We're going to jump in and start with 5 questions, and then if we have more time, we will address others. These questions are for all panelists. So the first question from one of our attendees is, we have to onboard a large number of employees quickly after an acquisition. What's the best approach? And these employees are located in multiple countries. So for our panelists who would like to take that question.
Yeah, Paul, this is Chrissy. I'll take that one. And again, I think this kind of goes back to what I was just talking about. Every situation is different, and I don't know the details behind this particular situation, whether you have legal entities set up already. I don't know the number of employees that you're bringing on board, but I can tell you that in our situation, we needed to bring employees on, about 60 of them in a 6-week time frame. And really how we were able to achieve that was, number one, working with Global Upside to help us get our payroll in place. I would say that's probably the most critical, so that you can actually be able to pay your employees. And we were able to do that very fast, and actually required really no administrative burden on the employer, meaning Aclara. And depending on the number of employees that you have, I think it says a large number. I mean, it really depends on what structure that you currently have in place. But I would say if you have legal entities in place and you need to bring them on board quickly, I do think that outsourcing your payroll very quick is really the only way to do it very quickly from a payroll standpoint.
Great, thank you. Our next question, what are some of the non-salary infrastructure costs we need to consider when expanding into a new country?
Hi, this is Raghu, and let me try and answer that one. Because when you go down a PEO model, what you're doing is you're obviously not employing that person, so to speak, on your payroll, so you don't have to have any infrastructure. But like I talked about earlier, you have to incorporate an entity. You obviously have to have a bank account, and all of this costs money to establish. You may have a resident director issue in many countries, somebody who's a local national who can be your director, a registered office issue because that's where the government or anybody else can send you mail. And these are some of the things that some of them might apply one time. Incorporation type, resident director type might be an ongoing cost. Plus, then you have to keep accounting records, you have to file returns on a monthly, quarterly basis. You obviously have to process payroll, which you may or may not have that talent here in the U.S. in your current accounting structure. And some of these things, Chrissy mentioned that, they didn't have the experience or the knowledge. And then at come end of year, you have statutory audit requirements depending on your size and location. You may have you have an income tax requirement. Every country requires that, and in most countries there is what is called company law compliance requirements. Among other things, they might require you to do an annual report and things like that. And so all of this adds up to a fairly significant number. And so these are things that you need to keep in mind as you expand your footprint across the globe.
Great, thank you, Raghu. Our third question is, what are the mandated legal requirements from the employer before hiring an employee outside of the U.S.? Who would like to take that question?
Yeah, this is Jane. I can take that. I would say one word: burdensome. Most of the countries require an employment contract rather than an offer letter that we often see in the U.S. I think one of the biggest mistakes I've seen over the years is it's like time is of an essence, and a U.S. company doesn't have many options open to them, and so they'll often send a U.S.-style letter mentioning things like at-will employment and so on, which simply don't stand up in other jurisdictions. So when you create a legal document which is already not compliant in that country, you've created so many problems if you are ever taken to court, and it won't stand up. So I would say that really focusing on making sure you have a locally compliant employment contract that complies with local regulations. Many other countries, in particular, say France, Brazil, the job will be governed by a collective bargaining agreement, and that is a concept which is pretty foreign to US HR and legal, and knowing which collective bargaining agreement to pick to be most favorable and how to work that to your advantage and how to incorporate what's in the CBA into your contract can be a big headache. So I would say you either offload it to the PEO because it's now their responsibility as the legal employer, or you get advice on it to make sure that those foundations are absolutely rock solid. I couldn't stress that enough.
The one issue that reminded me as you were talking about the employment contracts is that in a lot of countries there is a bilingual requirement, so an English contract in Ukraine is unenforceable. Yes, you have signed one, forget the content, whether it's locally compliant or not, but it is unenforceable and the employee has a leg up. So that issue applies in many jurisdictions, so you have to be mindful of that. And if you sign only in the foreign language, the issue becomes does somebody at headquarters read and understand Ukrainian or Russian, which are acceptable languages there, so that later on if there's an issue, somebody sitting at headquarters can read it, interpret it, and give advice. And so those are also challenges as you go overseas.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question, how do you get the best benefits when you have a small number of employees in that location?
Yeah, this is Jane. I would say that the starting point is how many employees do you have, because you will still be in a situation if you have your own entity to do you have enough employees to get a group plan in that local country? A PEO will have a group plan in some countries, but not all. But you may still just have to do a taxable stipend for an individual plan. I would just step back a moment from that question, though, and say, what benefits do you want in that country? I've frequently seen US teams. We all start with what we know, don't we? We start with medical, dental, vision, 401k, long and short-term disability, and so on. But the question is, do you actually need that in the jurisdiction that you're going to? For instance, the medical scheme in Japan is extremely strong, and you wouldn't expect to see any sort of supplementary medical provision, but you might, for instance, see a small top-up, for instance, on life assurance. So I would always start with the question about what do you actually need, because it could be quite different in that country to what you're expecting from a US perspective.
And you know, part of benefits is also from a company employer perspective are things like car allowance, cell phone reimbursement, things like that. And a lot of times what happens is you may have a public or a private company in the US that thinks, yes, we've done the right things, we've got a travel policy or an expense reimbursement policy that we've drafted that we think works globally. Excepting when they start going into these foreign countries, yes, your expense policy is very valid in the US, you can enforce it and employees will react properly to the right behavior that you're promoting. It doesn't work in other countries. Some places, the policies that are in the US, as an example, are invalid. So an NDA that a new incoming employee signs in the US, you have an Indian employee sign it, it's invalid because it's actually illegal to sign that piece of paper that was signed in the US. You cannot give certain rights away. You can enforce other rights that you cannot enforce in the US, as an example. So benefits is a very broad subject in that respect. Jane obviously pointed out a lot of very good points, but think about it that without the right expertise or experts helping you with that, from a contract perspective, from an NDA perspective, things like that, you can actually get into more trouble because you have engaged in a contractual arrangement with an employee that may or may not be legal in that country, may or may not be enforceable at a later date. And by the way, remember the rules are the same across the world where the employer is the bad person, the employee courts favor the employee, things like that. In socialist countries, they favor them even more. So you're starting off not with a leg up, but a leg down, so to speak. You're starting off in the hole to begin with. So right expertise, right advice is very important.
Thank you, Raghu. Our next question, we need to hire quickly in Southeast Asia. What is the recommendation? PEO or set up our own entity? How do we source local talent in Southeast Asia? Who would like to take that?
This is Jane. I think that it's your definition of quickly. Just going back to the slide earlier about entity or PEO, if it's speed to market, a PEO will get you the flexibility of getting that person hired so you don't lose the talent straight away. It buys you time. It buys you time to think about where you're going with a particular country. I would say that PEO, if it's a matter of time, but then buys you time to think about what your taxable profile is going to be in that country. Raghu, did you want to pick up the point about talent?
Yeah, but before we pick up the point about talent, I do want to say that, like Jane was saying, quickly is relative. In Australia, it's 1 day. In China, it's 3 months. And so, explore this a little bit more with the right service providers, with the right experts, so you can then you can better judge your options. And yes, PEO is a much faster option than most times entity formation is. But I think the talent acquisition piece, I would like to turn over to Paul. He's the staffing expert versus myself.
Sure, and that's definitely a loaded question. So it would really depend on, I'd say, first of all, what does your employment brand look like, and what is the demographic that you're going after? For our clients where we source talent in Southeast Asia, we have partners within that country, that local time zone, speak the language, and understand that if you're going to source talent in China, you have to fully understand the province and the area. 5 miles in China versus 5 miles in Silicon Valley can make a huge difference. But really going back to, like with our model, we have a RPO model as well at Global Upside. We have individuals that are on the ground in these countries with a network that are available to identify the talent that you're looking for. So I would say, if I was to break it down, number one, what does your employment brand look like? Are you getting your message in front of the right audience? And then as you're looking at that audience, whether they're a millennial or they have 20 years of experience, how can you get your message in front of that local market effectively? In the U.S., I know LinkedIn is very popular. In Asia Pacific, even the monsters of the world still have a pretty good presence. So understanding the audience, understanding the demographic, and putting your brand in front of the right audience. And since that is kind of a loaded question, depending on the skill set you're looking for, don't hesitate to reach out to me directly, or info at Global Upside, and we can spend a little bit more time on that topic. I believe we have 1 more minute. 1 more question. Great. Our last question, what does it take to start payroll in a new country? Who would like to take that?
Chrissy, would you like to take that? You've done plenty of these recently.
I know. I was that's a loaded question, and it actually depends on what country that you're starting the payroll in. For me, like I said, I did Spain and UK initially. I would say Spain was the most challenging, mostly because it's the language barrier, and it's very complex with collective bargaining arrangements and work councils and different situations. And that's really where Global Upside helped me, because they knew all about that. And they really guided me through that process as to how do you set up a payroll in Spain. The setup, what goes into it, the taxation. Really, they really did do that all for me at the time we were going through it. And like I said, the United Kingdom was completely different. It really just depends on what country, but again, I can't stress enough that, and it does take a lot. It takes a lot of time to kind of figure it out a little bit and understand. Again, Global Upside helped me navigate me through that, but it also took me a little bit to kind of figure it out, all the steps necessary, the registrations with Social Security, but I could not have done that without expertise behind me. And it is possible with very little knowledge, and again, we did that in 5 to 6 weeks, so you can do it very quickly. You just need to make sure that you have someone who knows what they're doing and is helping you set that up.
Great. Thank you so much, Chrissy. If anyone has additional questions, you can feel free to reach out to our expert panelists, or you can email your question to info@globalupside.com. We want to thank everyone for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend this webinar, and we hope you have a great week.
Thanks, everyone.